Alright, so we're going to go over the next two properties of equality, and that's the multiplication property of equality and the division property of equality. And again, you've already done these properties, you just didn't know you were doing them in solving equations. And so I just want to talk about what they are, kind of understanding them and how they apply to solving equations. So with the multiplication property, if A equals B, then AC equals BC. Now we're to understand that A is being multiplied by C and B is being multiplied by C. So what this means is that if two things are equal, if I multiply those things by the same constant or same number, I'm still going to have two things that are equal. So to kind of understand this, again, using the scale, let's imagine, again, I'll use the 5-pound weight. Let's imagine I have a 5-pound weight on the left side and a 5-pound weight on the right side. And let's say I wanted to double the amount on both sides of the scale. So if I want to double the amount on the left side, I would just put another 5-pound weight on there. If I wanted to double, and again, when I say double, what I mean is multiply by 2. So multiplying by 2 is the same thing as doubling. So if I double the amount on the right side, I would have another 5-pound weight, in which case they are still balanced. They are still equal. Okay? And so when we're saying the multiplication property means if I have two things that are equal, if I multiply them by the same amount, meaning if let's say I doubled both sides or I tripled both sides, which would be multiplying by 3, or even multiply by a certain amount of fraction, it doesn't matter. If I multiply by the same thing on both sides, I'm still going to have two things that are equal. Now the way this looks in an equation would be something like this. So if you've solved equations like this before, and I asked you to get x by itself, hopefully you would say, well, I'd multiply both sides by 3. You'd cancel the 3's and say x equals 15. Now the reason you're able to do that is because of the multiplication property of equality. I took two things that were equal. The two things that were equal were x over 3 and 5. And again, they were equal because I told you they were equal. And then I multiplied them both by the same value. So you could say I tripled both sides. And because I did the multiply by the same thing on both sides, then they are still equal or still balanced. And so that's the multiplication property of equality. And that would be an example of using it in an equation. Now, if I'm going to do the division property of equality, so the division property of equality, it says if A equals B, but notice, there's something a little bit extra here, and it says, and C is not 0. And I'll explain why that's important here in a minute. But if A equals B, and actually I'm going to write it down here. If A equals B, then A divided by C equals B divided by C. Again, so what that is saying is, if I have two things that are equal, and I can divide them by the same thing, or the same number, same value, and still have two things that are equal. And I wanted to write it down there just for room's sake. But notice what it says here, that C cannot be 0. And the reason C can't be 0, hopefully you know by now that you cannot divide by 0. So notice there's a little caveat there with division property. Because we are dividing, there's some limitations. We're never allowed to divide by 0. I can explain that later why that is, but we won't get into that now. But we cannot divide by 0, but anything else we divide by, the two things will still be equal. Now, to look at the example I did over here, so the scale, is imagine I said I wanted, so right now they're equal. They both have 10 pounds on both sides. If I said I wanted to cut both sides in half, meaning I want to take half off of the left side and half off of the right side. If I did that, I would still have a balanced scale. So I would still have the same thing on the left and the right side. Now the way this looks like with solving equations, you've done it before. If I said solve that equation, hopefully you would divide both sides by 3. And get x equals 5. The reason you would do that, or the reason you're allowed to do that, is because of the division property of equality, which again says if I divide both sides by the same thing, I still have two things that are equal. And so hopefully this helps. I'm going to do the next two properties in the next video.